Four men in leather jackets surrounded a blind man sitting alone on a park bench, laughing as they kicked his white cane into the gutter. They thought he was the easiest mark in the whole county, an old soldier who couldn't even see their fists coming. What they didn't know was that the dog lying quietly at his feet had once cleared buildings in Kandahar, and the man himself had spent 11 years learning how to fight in total darkness. In the next few minutes, this quiet corner of Millbrook Falls would become the last place on earth those four men ever wanted to be, and the shockwaves from what happened there would tear a corrupt town wide open. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from, and if stories about courage, loyalty, and justice move you. Please subscribe to support our channel. The town of Millbrook Falls sat tucked between two low forested ridgelines in western Oregon, the kind of place that still had a single blinking traffic light, downtown, and a hardware store that had been owned by the same family for 3 generations. Rain fell there more often than not, a soft gray drizzle that coated the sidewalks in a thin sheen and made the maple leaves along Main Street glisten like they'd been polished. It was a town that looked from a distance like the picture on a postcard. It was also a town, like so many small towns before it, that had a rot growing quietly underneath its charming surface, one that most of its residents chose not to see. Daniel Voss had lived in Millbrook Falls for going on 3 years. He'd come there because it was quiet, because the rent was cheap, and because nobody asked too many questions about the thin white scars that ran along his jaw or the way his eyes, though open, never quite tracked the person speaking to him. Daniel was 36 years old, built like a man who had once carried 80 pounds of gear up mountain trails for a living, with close-cropped dark hair going gray at the temples and forearms roped with old muscle that hadn't entirely faded even 2 years after his discharge. He had spent 11 years as an Army Ranger, most of them attached to units that didn't officially exist on paper, doing work that he would never speak of to anyone. Not even in his sleep, though sometimes his sleep spoke for him anyway. The blast that took his sight had happened during his final deployment, an improvised device buried under a stretch of road outside a village, whose name he had stopped saying out loud. He remembered the heat before he remembered the sound. He remembered waking up in a hospital bed in Germany 3 days later to a doctor's voice telling him, very gently, that the damage to his optic nerves was permanent. He did not remember screaming, though the nurses told him later that he had. What he remembered clearly, what he would always remember clearly, was the moment 8 months later when a trainer at a veterans service center placed a leash in his hand and a cold, wet nose pressed itself against his palm. That was Duke. Duke was a Belgian Malinois, 7 years old now, with a coat the color of dark honey and black markings across his muzzle that made him look, in the words of the trainer who'd first introduced them, like he was permanently unimpressed with the world. Before Duke had come to the Veterans Center, he had spent 4 years as a military working dog attached to an explosive detection unit, deployed twice, credited with locating devices that had saved more lives than anyone had bothered to count. He had been retired, not because his nose had failed him, but because a training injury had left him with a permanent limp in his left rear leg, not severe enough to end his life, but severe enough to end his career. 2 broken creatures, then paired together by a system that had at least gotten one thing right. Duke did not simply guide Daniel through the world. Duke had been trained, quietly, patiently, by a service dog organization that specialized in veterans exactly like Daniel, to do both jobs at once. He was a guide dog by day, and underneath that gentle exterior, still every inch the disciplined protector he had always been. People who passed Daniel and Duke on the sidewalks of Millbrook Falls usually saw only the dark glasses, the folded white cane tucked under one arm, the harness with its stiff handle, and the calm, obedient dog leading a blind man carefully around puddles and uneven curbs. They saw a story of quiet tragedy and quiet triumph, and most of them felt a small flicker of sympathy before returning to their own lives. Almost none of them understood what they were actually looking at. A trained combat veteran who could still, by sound and memory and instinct, fight better blind than most men could fight with both eyes wide open. and a decorated military working dog who had never once, in his entire service, failed to complete a mission. People often mistake stillness for weakness. They see calm and assume there is nothing underneath it. They rarely stop to consider that the deepest waters are almost always the ones that look the most still on the surface. Daniel's routine rarely changed. Every morning, rain or shine, he walked 6 blocks from his small rented house to Founders Park, a modest square of green space in the center of town with a gazebo, a war memorial listing the names of Millbrook Falls residents who had died in service, and a scattering of benches beneath old oak trees. He would sit on the same bench, the third one from the memorial, and listen. He listened to the birds, to the traffic on Main Street, to the particular creak of the gazebo's old boards, when the wind pushed against them. He had learned, in the 2 years since his discharge, that listening was its own kind of seeing, if you gave it enough patience. On a gray Tuesday morning in early October, Daniel sat on his usual bench with Duke lying at his feet, the dog's chin resting on his master's boot, exactly as it always did. The town moved around him in its usual, unhurried rhythm. A mail truck idled somewhere down the block. 2 women walked past pushing strollers, their voices dropping into the particular hush people use when they see a blind man, and assume he can't hear them talking about him. Daniel could hear every word. He had long since stopped letting it bother him. What Daniel didn't know yet, what nobody in that quiet park knew yet, was that Millbrook Falls had a cancer growing in it, and that cancer had a name. The name was Roy Kessler, and the men who worked for him wore leather jackets and steel, toed boots, and called themselves the Iron Road Crew, though anyone who actually knew Roy Kessler understood that he was less interested in motorcycles than he was in something far more profitable: land. Roy Kessler had grown up poor in Millbrook Falls and had spent the last decade quietly buying up parcels along the river on the north side of town, using shell companies and straw buyers, so that no single name ever appeared too many times on any deed. His plan, patient and ugly, was to assemble enough contiguous riverfront property to sell the entire parcel to a resort developer out of Portland for more money than most people in Millbrook Falls would see in 3 lifetimes combined. There was only one problem: a scattering of longtime residents, older folks mostly, war widows and retired loggers, and more recently, a blind veteran who had bought his small house with cash from his disability settlement, refused to sell. And so Roy Kessler had turned, as men like him always eventually turn. To fear, his crew handled the harassment. Broken windows, here, slashed tires there. A dead animal left on a porch, as a message nobody wanted to say out loud. And standing quietly behind Roy Kessler, providing him cover whenever the harassment drew too much attention, was a man wearing a badge, Officer Bryce Colton of the Millbrook Falls Police Department. A man who had grown up alongside Kessler and had never once, in 15 years on the force, arrested him for anything. That morning, 4 members of the Iron Road Crew were walking through Founders Park on Kessler's orders, looking for exactly the kind of soft target that would send a message to the rest of the holdouts without drawing too much attention. Their leader was a broad-shouldered man named Deke Sullivan, 30 years old, with a shaved head, a jagged scar through one eyebrow, and knuckles wrapped in old scar tissue from years of bar fights. He'd mostly won. Behind him walked 3 other men, Gary, Toby, and a younger one they called Pistol, all of them wearing the same leather jackets, the same swagger, the same total absence of anything resembling a conscience. Deke Sullivan spotted Daniel from 30 feet away and slowed his pace, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "Would you look at that?" Deke said, loud enough for his crew to hear, loud enough, though he didn't realize it, for Daniel to hear too. Blind guy sitting all by himself. This town really does make it easy sometimes. Gary laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. "That's the one that won't sell his place to Kessler. Heard he's some kind of war hero. Don't look like much of a hero to me. Looks like a guy who can't even see us coming." Daniel did not move. He kept his hands folded loosely in his lap, his face angled slightly toward the sound of their voices. giving away absolutely nothing. Beside him, Duke lifted his head from Daniel's boot, ears rotating forward like twin radar dishes locking onto a signal. The dog did not growl. He did not bare his teeth. He simply watched, the way he had been trained to watch 1,000 times before, waiting for a single word from the only voice in the world that mattered to him. People often assume that danger announces itself loudly, with shouting and violence and obvious warning signs. But real danger, the kind that actually changes the course of a life, usually arrives exactly like this: 4 ordinary-looking men walking calmly across a sunlit park, laughing at a joke that isn't funny, closing the distance one careless step at a time. Deke Sullivan and his crew stopped directly in front of the bench, close enough that their shadows fell across Daniel's lap. Deke crouched down slightly, the way a person might crouch to speak to a child or a dog. "Hey, buddy," Deke said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "You know whose bench this is? This here's Iron Road property now. Everything in this park belongs to us on Tuesdays. You're gonna need to move along." "I was here first," Daniel said quietly. His voice was calm, almost gentle, carrying none of the tension that might have been expected from a blind man suddenly surrounded by 4 strangers. "There is plenty of other benches." Toby laughed. "Ooh, he's got some mouth on him for a guy who can't see who he's talking to." "I don't need to see you," Daniel said. "I can smell the cheap cologne and hear 4 sets of boots that don't know how to walk quietly. That tells me plenty." For a moment, something flickered across Deke Sullivan's face, an instinct buried deep under years of bullying people smaller and weaker than himself, that told him something about this was wrong, that this blind man's calm wasn't the calm of fear, but the calm of something else entirely. But instincts like that are easy to ignore when you've spent your whole life getting away with cruelty. And Deke Sullivan had never learned to listen to the quiet voice that occasionally tried to warn him. "Real funny," Deke said, straightening up. "Let's see how funny you are without your little cane." He reached down, snatched the folded white cane from where it rested against the bench beside Daniel, and with a casual, contemptuous flick of his wrist, threw it into the storm gutter at the edge of the park path. It landed with a small clatter, half submerged in a puddle of gray rainwater. The 3 men behind Deke laughed. Pistol, the youngest, pulled out his phone and started recording, grinning, already imagining how many views this would get on whatever corner of the internet he liked to share videos like this on. Daniel did not reach for the cane. He did not raise his voice. He sat perfectly still, and something in his stillness should have warned them, if any of them had been paying close enough attention to notice. Duke had gone rigid beside him, every muscle in the dog's compact, powerful body coiled tight, his amber eyes locked on Deke Sullivan's hands, tracking every movement the way he had once tracked wires and pressure plates buried beneath desert roads. A low vibration had started somewhere deep in his chest. Not yet a growl, just the promise of one. "Careful," Gary said, taking a half step back. "That dog looks like it wants to bite somebody." "It's a service dog," Deke said dismissively. "They're trained not to do anything. That's the whole point of a service dog, dummy. He just sits there and looks pathetic, same as his owner." "You should pick up my cane," Daniel said. His voice had not changed at all. It remained level, quiet, almost conversational. "You don't want to keep going down this road." Deke Sullivan threw his head back and laughed, a loud, ugly sound that echoed across the empty park. "You hear this guy, blind as a bat and threatening me? That's the funniest thing I've heard all week." He stepped forward and shoved Daniel's shoulder, hard, rocking him sideways on the bench. "Maybe you didn't hear me the first time. Move along." That shove was the last mistake Deke Sullivan would make that morning, though he had no way of knowing it yet. Daniel's body reacted before his mind had even finished processing the insult. 11 years of training, taking over in a way that felt less like a decision and more like breathing. His right hand shot out and caught Deke's wrist in an iron grip before the man could fully withdraw it. and in one fluid motion honed across a decade of close-quarters combat drills, conducted in pitch darkness precisely because Rangers sometimes had to fight when they couldn't see either. Daniel twisted the wrist, stepped inside Dake's space, and used the bigger man's own forward momentum to drive him face first into the wet grass beside the bench. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. Deke Sullivan hit the ground with a startled grunt. The wind knocked out of him. His cheek pressed into the cold, damp earth. For a full heartbeat, nobody moved. Gary, Toby, and Pistol stood frozen, staring down at their leader sprawled in the grass, unable to process what they had just witnessed. A blind man had just put a 200-pound gang enforcer on the ground without appearing to look at him at all. "He can't even see," Toby said stupidly, as though saying it out loud might make it unhappen. "Get him?" Deke growled from the ground, spitting out a mouthful of grass, humiliation burning hotter in his chest than any physical pain. "Get him now." Gary lunged first, swinging a wide, clumsy right, hook aimed at where he guessed Daniel's head would be. Daniel heard the shift of weight, the whisper of fabric, the faint change in air pressure, a fraction of a second before the fist arrived, and he ducked under it with the same economical, unhurried motion of a man who had rehearsed this exact scenario 10,000 times in a pitch-black training room designed specifically to simulate blindness in combat. He drove his elbow up into Gary's ribs, and the man folded with a wheeze, dropping to his knees. Toby came next, grabbing for Daniel's jacket, and Daniel used the man's own grip against him, pulling him forward and off balance and sending him stumbling into an overturned bench. Duke had waited exactly as long as his training demanded, watching his handler handle the first 2 threats with the discipline of an animal who understood that his job was not to attack the moment danger appeared, but to attack the moment his handler needed him. When Pistol, phone still recording, made the mistake of stepping toward Daniel's exposed flank with something small and metallic glinting in his other hand, Duke exploded off the ground. He did not bark. He did not growl a warning first. 7 years of training had taught him that warnings were for situations where warnings still mattered, and this was no longer that situation. Duke closed the 6 feet between himself and Pistol in under a second, a coiled spring of honey, colored muscle, and clamped his powerful jaws around the young man's forearm, not tearing, not shredding, simply locking down with enough controlled pressure to make the metallic object, a cheap folding knife, clatter uselessly to the pavement. Pistol screamed, more from shock than pain, dropping his phone as he tried desperately to shake the dog loose. Duke did not let go. He planted his front paws and pulled, dragging the young man off balance and down onto the grass, holding the position exactly as he had been trained to hold 1,000 times before during simulated apprehension exercises back on base. Deke Sullivan, finally scrambling back to his feet, mud smeared across his cheek and fury burning in his eyes, looked at the scene around him. Gary doubled over and wheezing. Toby tangled in the wreckage of an overturned park bench. Pistol pinned to the ground by a dog he had assumed was harmless, and in the center of it all, standing perfectly calm, dark glasses still in place, not a single hair out of order. The blind man who had somehow impossibly dismantled all 4 of them in under 30 seconds. "You're going to regret this," Deke Sullivan said, his voice shaking with a rage that had nowhere useful to go. "Release," Daniel said quietly, and Duke immediately opened his jaws and stepped back from Pistol, though his amber eyes never left the 4 men, his body still coiled and ready, a low continuous rumble still vibrating in his chest. It was in that exact moment, as Deke Sullivan stood there, humiliated and furious in the middle of Founders Park, that the sound of a slow-rolling patrol car reached Daniel's ears. He recognized the particular rattle of a loose exhaust pipe. He'd heard that same patrol car idle outside his house more than once in the last few months, always for no stated reason, always disappearing again after a few minutes. Officer Bryce Colton stepped out of the cruiser, adjusting his belt with a lazy, self-satisfied swagger of a man who had never once in his career expected to be questioned. He was in his mid-40s, thick through the middle, with small eyes set close together, and a mustache that had gone mostly gray. He surveyed the scene in the park, the overturned bench, the 4 Iron Road men sprawled or standing in various states of disarray, and the blind veteran standing calmly beside his dog, and his face settled immediately into an expression of practiced, performative concern that fooled absolutely no one who was paying attention. "What in the hell happened here?" Officer Colton said, though his tone made clear. He had already decided the answer before asking the question. "He attacked us," Deke Sullivan said immediately, seizing the opening with the ease of a man who had used this exact tactic before. "Came at us out of nowhere. Sixed his dog on my guy over there. We were just walking through the park, minding our own business." "That's a lie," Daniel said calmly. "They threw my cane in the gutter and shoved me. I defended myself. My dog defended me when one of them pulled a knife." Officer Colton's eyes flicked toward Pistol's folding knife lying on the grass, then away again, as though he had decided not to have seen it at all. "4 witnesses saying otherwise," he said. "That's a mighty big coincidence." 4 members of the Iron Road crew, Daniel said, his voice never rising, never cracking, "who work for Roy Kessler, who has been trying to buy my house out from under me for 8 months. I don't need to see your face, officer, to know exactly whose side you're on." A muscle twitched in Colton's jaw. "That's a real, serious accusation, mister. You want to be real careful making accusations like that." He unclipped a set of handcuffs from his belt, the metal clinking softly in the damp morning air. "I'm going to need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back." "On what charge?" Daniel asked, still not moving. "Assault," Colton said. "Maybe reckless endangerment. Once I get a look at what that animal did to this young man's arm. We'll sort out the details down at the station." Duke's growl deepened, a warning rumble aimed directly at the approaching officer, and Daniel immediately laid a steady hand on the dog's head. "Hold," he said quietly, and Duke's growl faded though the dog's body remained rigid, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding around his handler. A small crowd had begun to gather at the edges of the park, drawn by the noise, the way small crowds always eventually gather in small towns. A woman walking her own dog had stopped on the path, her hand pressed to her mouth. An elderly man sitting on the memorial steps had lowered his newspaper. None of them said a word. None of them stepped forward. They simply watched, the way people in Millbrook Falls had apparently learned to watch quietly from a safe distance. Whenever Roy Kessler's name came up in any capacity, people often believe that silence is neutral, that standing back and saying nothing is somehow different from taking a side. It rarely is silence. More often than not, is simply cowardice wearing the mask of caution. Officer Colton grabbed Daniel's arm, not gently, and turned him around, pulling his wrists together behind his back. Daniel did not resist. He had long ago learned, in a career built entirely around discipline and restraint, that some battles were not won by fighting them in the moment. He felt the cold metal close around his wrists, click by click, and he kept his breathing slow, and even the way he had trained himself to breathe through far worse things than this. "Duke heel," Daniel said softly, and the dog fell into step beside him without hesitation, though his eyes remained locked on Deke Sullivan and his crew with an intensity that made all 4 of them take an unconscious step backward. As Officer Colton walked Daniel toward the patrol car, a white van with the words Millbrook County Animal Control stenciled on its side pulled up along the curb. Colton must have called ahead. 2 men in thick canvas jackets climbed out, carrying a long aluminum catch pole with a wire loop at the end. "He's a certified service dog," Daniel said, and for the first time a thread of real urgency entered his voice. "He has documentation. You cannot take him." "Animal bit a civilian," Colton said flatly, not even bothering to look at Daniel as he said it. "Standard procedure. He'll get evaluated, and if he checks out, you'll get him back." Duke felt the shift in the air immediately, sensed the approaching threat to the only routine, the only anchor he had left in a world that had already taken so much from him once before. He did not lunge. He did not snap. But he pressed himself hard against Daniel's leg, refusing to move, a low, mournful sound rising in his throat that was unlike any warning growl he had ever made. A sound closer to grief than aggression. "Easy, boy," Daniel whispered, his composure cracking for just a moment, just long enough for something raw and desperate to show through. "It's going to be okay." It was, in that moment, the first lie Daniel had told in longer than he could remember. The catch-pole's wire loop tightened around Duke's neck, and the dog was led, reluctantly, painfully, toward the waiting van, casting one final look back over his shoulder at the man he had guided through darkness for 2 straight years. The van doors slammed shut with a hollow metallic finality that echoed across the quiet park. Daniel was placed in the back of the patrol car, and as it pulled away from Founders Park, he sat in silence, his wrists aching against the cuffs, his ears straining uselessly for a sound that had already faded into the distance. What Daniel did not know, what nobody in that patrol car or that park could have known, was that young Pistol's phone, dropped and cracked but still recording, had captured every single second of what had actually happened. And that phone was about to change everything. The phone lay forgotten in the wet grass of Founders Park for nearly 20 minutes after the patrol car and the animal control van had both driven away, its screen still glowing, still recording an empty park and a fallen bench. And if you looked closely enough, the small folded white cane lying half, submerged in the gutter where it had been so casually discarded. It was a teenager named Casey Whitfield who found it, a 17-year-old with a part-time job at the hardware store who cut through the park every morning, on his way to open the shop. Casey had heard the commotion from 2 blocks away and arrived just in time to see the tail end of the confrontation. Though he'd been too frightened to step closer. When he found the cracked phone lying in the grass, he almost left it alone, almost. But something made him pick it up, and something made him watch the last few minutes of footage before deciding what to do with it. What he saw changed the entire trajectory of the day, and eventually, the entire trajectory of Millbrook Falls. Casey watched the footage twice, his hands shaking. He saw Deke Sullivan throw the cane in the gutter. He saw the shove. He saw Daniel's controlled, almost gentle takedown of 4 much larger men. He saw Pistol's knife glinting in the gray morning light before Duke intervened. And crucially buried in the audio, he heard Deke Sullivan's voice, clear as day, saying the words that would matter more than anything else that had happened. Heard he's some kind of war hero. Don't look like much of a hero to me. Casey did not know Daniel personally, but his grandfather had served 2 tours in Vietnam, and something about watching a blind veteran get beaten down by 4 bullies and then arrested for defending himself lit a fire in Casey's chest that he didn't fully understand yet. He walked straight to the hardware store, told his boss he needed the morning off, and instead walked 6 blocks to the offices of the Millbrook Falls Gazette, the town's small weekly newspaper that mostly covered school board meetings and high school football scores. The editor of the Gazette was a woman named Louise Pruitt, 61 years old, sharp-eyed and stubborn, who had been trying for the better part of a year to write a story about the mysterious pattern of property sales along the river, without ever quite being able to prove anything. When Casey showed her the video on the cracked phone, Louise Pruitt sat very still for a long moment, watching it 3 times through before finally looking up at the teenager standing nervously in her doorway. "Casey," she said quietly, "I think you just handed me the story of my career." By that evening, the video had been uploaded to the newspaper's small social media page, accompanied by a short, carefully worded article that raised more questions than it answered, but asked all the right ones. By midnight, it had been shared 4,000 times. By the following morning, it had crossed into the hundreds of thousands. Then the millions, as veterans groups across the country picked it up, outraged at the sight of a disabled combat veteran being manhandled by a small-town police officer, while 4 able-bodied attackers walked away without so much as a citation. The comments section filled with fury. People demanded to know the officer's name. People demanded to know why the dog had been taken. Someone with sharp eyes noticed the iron road jacket patches and began digging, and within another few hours, amateur internet investigators had connected Deke Sullivan and his crew to a string of property disputes along the river, and from there to a name that had been very carefully kept out of any official paperwork. Roy Kessler, in a modest but expensively furnished office above the Millbrook Falls feed and supply store that he'd quietly purchased 2 years earlier and gutted into something resembling a corporate headquarters. Roy Kessler watched the video on his laptop with a growing cold fury. He was 52 years old, thick-necked and sunburned, wearing a flannel shirt that did nothing to disguise the fact that he had more money in offshore accounts than most of Millbrook Falls' population combined would see in their lifetimes. "Get me Colton," Kessler said to the man sitting across from him, a nervous accountant named Phil Renner, who handled the paperwork for Kessler's shell companies. Right now, when Officer Bryce Colton arrived at the office 20 minutes later, sweating despite the cool October air, Kessler didn't even look up from his laptop screen. "You told me this would be handled quietly," Kessler said. "You told me nobody would ask questions about a blind man getting roughed up by 4 of my boys." "I didn't know about the phone," Colton stammered. "Nobody knew about the phone." "That's not my problem," Kessler said. "That's your problem. You're the one whose face is all over the news right now, arresting a war hero for defending himself." He finally looked up, his eyes flat and dangerous. "I've got a federal task force sniffing around riverfront land, deals in 3 other counties. Bryce, the very last thing I need is a viral video pointing a spotlight directly at this town." "What do you want me to do?" Colton asked, his earlier bravado from the park entirely drained away. "Bury it," Kessler said simply. "Discredit the video, make sure the blind guy's story doesn't hold up, and find out who's been talking to that newspaper woman. Because somebody in my organization has a very loose mouth, and I intend to find out who." What Roy Kessler didn't know yet was that the loose mouth wasn't in his organization at all. It belonged to his own wife. Margaret Kessler had married Roy nearly 25 years earlier, back when he'd been a hard-working young man with a modest logging business and genuinely kind eyes before the money, and the ambition had slowly, patiently eaten away at everything decent inside him. She had watched, over the last several years, as her husband transformed into someone she barely recognized, someone who spoke about elderly widows and disabled veterans, the way other men spoke about obstacles on a spreadsheet. She had said nothing for a long time, telling herself it was politics, telling herself it was simply the cost of doing business in a hard world. But when Margaret Kessler saw the viral video of a blind man being handcuffed while his dog was dragged away in a catch pole, something inside her that had been slowly cracking for years finally broke completely. That night, while Roy snored in their bedroom down the hall, Margaret sat awake in her small home office, a laptop open in front of her, staring at a folder she had quietly been keeping for over a year. Bank statements. Shell company documents she wasn't supposed to have access to but had found anyway, tucked carelessly into a filing cabinet Roy had never bothered to lock because he never imagined his own wife would look. Recordings, made almost accidentally at first, of dinner conversations where Roy discussed his plans with a little too much confidence in front of a woman he'd stopped seeing as a threat years ago. She thought about Daniel Voss, a man she had actually spoken to once, briefly, in line at the grocery store, a soft-spoken veteran who had simply wanted to buy a bag of dog food and had thanked her politely when she'd held the door. She thought about his dog, taken away in a metal cage for the crime of protecting his handler. Margaret Kessler picked up her phone and, with hands that trembled only slightly, began composing an email to the only person in Millbrook Falls she thought might actually be able to do something with what she knew, Louise Pruitt, editor of the Gazette. Meanwhile, at the Millbrook County Animal Shelter, Duke lay curled in the corner of a cold concrete kennel, refusing to eat the food left in his bowl, his amber eyes fixed on the door, waiting for a command that never came. The shelter workers, most of them decent people simply following procedure, noted with some confusion that the dog showed no signs whatsoever of aggression, only a deep, patient, almost military stillness that none of them had words for. And at the county jail, Daniel Voss sat in a holding cell, his wrists finally free of the cuffs, but his heart heavier than it had been in the 2 years since the blast that took his sight. He had faced insurgents in the dark. He had faced the slow, grinding despair of learning to live without vision. But nothing in his 11 years of service had prepared him for the particular helplessness of sitting in a locked room, unable to see, unable to act, while the one creature who had rebuilt his entire world was locked away somewhere he could not reach. He thought about his old unit, about the men who had once trusted him with their lives in the dark. He thought about the quiet promise he had made to himself, the day Duke had first pressed a wet nose into his palm, that no matter what happened, he would never again let someone he loved be taken from him without a fight. Daniel Voss did not yet know about the viral video. He did not yet know about Casey Whitfield or Louise Pruitt, or the folder of evidence sitting on Margaret Kessler's laptop. But sitting alone in that cell, in the total darkness that had become his entire world, he made a decision, quiet and absolute, that Roy Kessler and Bryce Colton, and every single person who had helped bury the truth about what happened in Founders Park that morning, were about to discover exactly who they had chosen to cross. The following morning, Louise Pruitt received Margaret Kessler's email at 6:15 before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline east of town. She read it twice, her coffee going cold in front of her, and then picked up her phone and dialed a number she had saved months earlier, but never quite worked up the courage to use, the direct line for the FBI field office in Portland. Special Agent Renata Ford had been investigating a pattern of suspicious land acquisitions across 3 rural Oregon counties for the better part of 8 months, ever since a whistleblower at a Portland title company had flagged an unusual concentration of shell company purchases along protected riverfront zones. She was 44 years old, precise and unhurried, in the way of someone who had learned early in her career that impatience destroyed more cases than any defense attorney ever could. When Louise Pruitt's call came in, describing a viral video, a blind veteran, a disabled military dog dragged away by animal control, and now an anonymous tip from inside the very organization Ford had been quietly circling for months, she felt the particular electric stillness that came rarely when a case finally cracked open. "Send me everything," Agent Ford said. "The video, the tip, all of it. And Miss Pruitt, I need you to understand something. If what you're describing is accurate, this is no longer just a small-town story. This could be considerably bigger than Millbrook Falls." By that afternoon, 2 unmarked federal vehicles had rolled quietly into town, parking a discreet distance from both the Millbrook Falls Police Department and Roy Kessler's office above the feed store. Agent Ford did not announce her presence loudly. She spent the first several hours simply watching, cross-referencing property records with the shell company names Margaret Kessler had provided, confirming what she had suspected for months. Roy Kessler had spent nearly a decade quietly assembling one of the largest illegal riverfront land grabs in the state's recent history, using intimidation, harassment, and at least one compromised local police officer to force out anyone who refused to sell. That evening, Agent Ford visited the county jail. She sat across from Daniel Voss in a small interview room, her voice calm and direct in a way that Daniel, after 2 days of vague threats and unanswered questions from local officers, found almost startling in its honesty. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I've seen the footage from the park. I've also seen the arrest report Officer Colton filed, and I want you to know it does not match what that footage shows, not even close. I intend to see every charge against you dismissed, and I intend to see your dog returned to you as quickly as I can manage it. But I need your help understanding the full scope of what's been happening in this town." For the first time in 2 days, Daniel allowed himself something close to hope. He told her everything: the harassment he'd endured over the past 8 months, the persistent lowball offers on his house, the strange patrol car that idled outside his home for no stated reason. the names of two elderly neighbors who had sold their riverfront properties under circumstances that had never quite made sense to him. Agent Ford listened to every word without interrupting, and when Daniel finished, she said quietly, "Mr. Voss, I think you and that dog of yours are about to become very important witnesses in a federal case. I need you to hold on just a little bit longer." "How's Duke?" Daniel asked, and for the first time since his arrest, his composed, disciplined voice cracked slightly around the edges. "I'm working on it," Agent Ford said. "I promise you, I am working on it." The next morning, federal agents arrived at the Millbrook County Animal Shelter with a court order and a very specific request. The shelter director, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia Hume, who had spent the last 2 days deeply uneasy about the dog in Kennel 7, who refused to eat and never once broke his patient, watchful stillness, was almost relieved to hand over the paperwork. Duke was gently coaxed from his kennel, examined by a federal veterinarian who confirmed within minutes what Patricia Hume had already suspected. This was no dangerous animal. This was a decorated, disciplined former military working dog who had done exactly what he'd been trained to do. Duke was transported, under federal escort, directly to the county jail, and when the heavy door of the interview room swung open and the familiar click of dog nails on tile echoed down the hallway, Daniel Voss rose so quickly from his chair that the deputy, standing guard, instinctively reached for his radio. "Duke," Daniel said, his voice breaking completely now, no longer trying to hold anything back. The dog crossed the small room in 3 bounding strides and pressed his entire body against Daniel's legs, whining softly, his tail beating hard against the floor, and Daniel dropped to his knees right there on the cold tile, wrapping both arms around his partner's neck, burying his face in the dog's honey-colored fur, as 2 years of accumulated grief and 2 days of accumulated terror finally broke loose all at once. Agent Ford, standing quietly in the doorway, allowed herself a small, private smile before clearing her throat gently. "Mr. Voss," she said, "all charges against you have been formally dropped. You're free to go. But I have one more favor to ask of you, if you're willing." "Anything," Daniel said, still kneeling on the floor with one hand buried in Duke's fur. "There is going to be a trial," Agent Ford said. "A big one. Roy Kessler, Officer Colton, and several members of the Iron Road crew are being charged with conspiracy, extortion, obstruction of justice, and a list of other federal offenses. I don't have time to read you in full right now. We have strong evidence thanks to some very brave people in this town. But we need you to testify. We need the jury to understand exactly what kind of man Roy Kessler really is, and exactly what he was willing to do to a decorated combat veteran and his service dog to protect his profits." Daniel stood slowly, one hand resting on Duke's head, the dog leaning into the touch with the same quiet devotion he had shown for 2 straight years. "I've spent my whole life fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves," Daniel said. "I'm not about to stop now just because I can't see the enemy's face." The trial began 5 weeks later in the county courthouse, a squat brick building that had never in its history seen this much attention. News vans lined the street outside. Veterans groups from 3 states had organized a quiet, dignified presence on the courthouse steps, standing in respectful rows, many of them accompanied by their own service dogs. Inside the packed courtroom, the federal prosecutor, a sharp, methodical woman named Elaine Brooks, laid out the case with meticulous precision. She played the video from Founders Park for the jury, the footage from Pistol's cracked phone, now enhanced and clarified by FBI technicians, every second of the confrontation visible in devastating clarity. The jury watched as Deke Sullivan threw the white cane into the gutter. They watched Daniel absorb the shove and respond with restrained, disciplined precision. They watched Duke intervene only when a knife appeared, disarming young Pistol without inflicting a single unnecessary injury. They heard Margaret Kessler testify, her voice trembling but steady, describing years of quiet complicity that had finally become unbearable. They heard Louise Prout describe the pattern of suspicious property transfers she had been chasing for over a year. They heard Agent Ford lay out, with cold, methodical clarity, the full financial architecture of Roy Kessler's decade. Long scheme, the shell companies, the intimidation, the compromised officer who had looked the other way in exchange for envelopes of cash that federal investigators had traced back through no fewer than 4 separate accounts. But it was Daniel Voss's testimony that silenced the courtroom completely. He walked to the witness stand with Duke at his side, the dog's harness handle held loosely in one hand, and settled into the chair with the same quiet composure he had carried through every moment of the ordeal. "Mr. Voss," Elaine Brooks asked gently, "can you describe for the jury what happened when Officer Colton arrived at Founders Park that morning?" "He didn't ask what happened," Daniel said. "He'd already decided. I could hear it in his voice before he even got out of his car. He wasn't there to find the truth. He was there to protect Roy Kessler's interests, same as he'd apparently been doing for years. And when animal control arrived for your dog..." For the first time, Daniel's composure wavered slightly, and he reached down without looking, finding Duke's head with practiced ease, resting his hand there as though drawing strength from the contact. "That was the worst moment of my life," he said quietly. "Worse than the blast that took my sight. Worse than anything I went through overseas. Because in the service, when things went wrong, I always had some measure of control. Sitting in that cell, knowing they had my partner in a cage somewhere, and I couldn't do a single thing to help him. That broke something in me I didn't know could still break." He paused, and the courtroom sat in absolute silence, waiting. "Duke has never once failed a mission," Daniel continued, "not in his years of military service, and not in the 2 years he spent guiding me through a world I can't see anymore. He didn't fail one that morning in the park either. He protected me exactly the way he was trained to, exactly the way he's protected every person who's ever depended on him. The only ones who failed that day were the men who were supposed to serve and protect this town, and instead spent years serving and protecting Roy Kessler's bank account." Roy Kessler, seated at the defense table in an expensive suit that had somehow lost all of its former confidence, stared fixedly at the table in front of him, unable to meet the eyes of the jury. The trial lasted 11 days. When it concluded, Roy Kessler was convicted on all counts, including conspiracy, extortion, and obstruction of justice, and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Officer Bryce Colton was convicted of obstruction and accepting bribes, stripped of his badge, and sentenced to 6 years. Deke Sullivan and the rest of the Iron Road crew faced their own charges of assault and intimidation, with Deke himself receiving the harshest sentence for his role as the crew's enforcer. But it was young Pistol, the one whose knife had brought Duke into action, who surprised the courtroom during the sentencing phase. He stood, trembling, and asked the judge if he could speak directly to Daniel Voss. "I'm sorry," Pistol said, his voice cracking with a shame that seemed, at least in that moment, entirely genuine. "I didn't know you were a veteran. I didn't care that you were blind. I just did what Dake told me to do because I was scared of him, and that's not an excuse. I know it's not, but I need you to know I'm sorry. I've never forgotten what your dog's eyes looked like right before he grabbed my arm. Like he knew exactly what kind of person I was, better than I knew it myself." Daniel listened to the young man's shaking voice, and after a long moment he spoke, his tone carrying none of the anger that would have been entirely justified. "You made a choice that morning," Daniel said. "You can make a different one now. That's more than some people in this courtroom ever managed to do." In the weeks that followed the trial, Millbrook Falls began, slowly and imperfectly, to heal. The riverfront properties Roy Kessler had accumulated through fear and fraud were returned to their rightful owners or placed under a court-ordered trust designed to prevent any similar scheme from ever taking root there again. Louise Pruitt's newspaper, once a modest weekly covering school board meetings, found itself with a national reputation and a small but dedicated investigative team, funded in part by a wave of donations from grateful veterans across the country. Margaret Kessler filed for divorce and used a portion of the settlement to establish a small scholarship fund for children of local veterans, a quiet penance for years of silence she could never fully forgive herself for. And Daniel Voss returned to Founders Park, walking the same 6 blocks he always had, sitting on the same bench, third from the memorial, with Duke lying at his feet, exactly as always, chin resting on his boot. Someone, in the months since the trial, had quietly installed a small brass plaque on the back of that bench, paid for by donations from veterans as far away as Texas and Maine. It read simply, "For Daniel and Duke, who proved that true sight has nothing to do with the eyes." Casey Whitfield still cut through the park on his way to open the hardware store every morning, and he had taken, in recent months, to stopping for a few minutes to sit with Daniel and scratch Duke behind the ears. The two of them talking quietly about nothing in particular, the way friends do. The elderly man who had once watched silently from the memorial steps now made a point of nodding respectfully to Daniel every morning. A small gesture, but one that mattered more than he probably realized. Duke, for his part, had returned entirely to his old self within days of his reunion with Daniel, eating heartily, sleeping soundly, resuming his patient, dignified guidance of the man he had chosen, in whatever way dogs choose such things, to protect for the rest of both their lives. The story of Daniel and Duke reminds us that true strength has never depended on the ability to see danger coming. It depends on the discipline to stand firm when danger arrives anyway, and on the loyalty of those, human or animal, who choose to stand beside us when the rest of the world chooses to look away. In a town that had spent years quietly averting its eyes from the corruption growing in its own soil, it took a blind man and his dog to finally show everyone else what courage actually looks like. May this story remind you that the quietest people you meet are sometimes carrying the heaviest burdens, and the most overlooked among us are sometimes the very ones equipped to save everyone else. If Daniel and Duke's courage moved you today, please share this story with someone who needs a reminder that justice, however slowly, still finds its way to the light. Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts, and please subscribe to our channel for more stories of quiet heroism and unbreakable loyalty. May God bless every veteran, every service animal, and every ordinary person who finds the courage to speak up when silence would be so much easier. If you believe that true courage often comes from the places we least expect it, please type Amen in the comments below. And before you go, tell us in the comments, what town or city are you watching this story from tonight?